Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In a Nick of Time. This is great to have you again today. Numerous on the show as every week. We're very lucky to have a great community to help ensure that our kids have a fighting chance at winning against China 20 years from now. And this is going to be part of the topic today, trying to look at how we are doing when it comes to AI, machine learning, and cyber against China and what's going on in Ukraine, and of course with Taiwan as well. But we're also going to do deep technical dive today with our guest Joe Saunders, the founder and CEO of RunSafe. We're going to look at memory-based exploits. We're going to look at 5G. We're going to look at supply chain, open source software. So it's going to be a lot of great discussions on really everything around cybersecurity and software innovation and the importance of baked-in security and all that good stuff. So I hope you're going to enjoy the show. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everybody that we launched Learn with Nick, and if you want to check it out and you haven't done that yet, go on learnwithnick.com, and you're going to be able to have 2 coupon codes. If you're military, civilian, or veteran, you can use the military 50% off coupon. If you are not one of those, you can use the Let's Beat China and get 20% off. We have a few seats left before it goes away. And like I said before, we are doing a partnership with a great company we're going to announce in a couple of weeks. We're going to bring a ton of content, technical, hands-on deep dive, exercises, labs, really getting access to a sandbox to put it to practice and really try things out on Kubernetes and cloud things and data science and so on. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to also create a virtual world, kind of a metaverse 2D with different rooms and different things to see. CNCF companies able to create space there and share their announcements and releases. And it's going to be a whole community of DevSecOps, digital transformation. And we're going to be working on this with the Linux Foundation and CNCF and many other partners. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So check it out. Go and Learn with Nick. You have a 10-day free trial if you want to try it out. The video we just released last week was about digital twin. So if you want to know why digital twin is so important, if you're building capabilities to be able to emulate before you bend metal, check it out. It's a pretty good summary of the importance of digital twin. The video this week is going to be about the Uber hack and the lessons learned so far on how to prevent it and what happened. So it's going to be interesting to deep dive into what we know so far from that hack and discussions on Telegram with the actual hacker. So it will be fun. So check that out this week when we publish it at the end of the week. And finally, if you have not registered yet, go to inanicoftime.tv and do that so we can notify you of these next videos and the next guests on the show. All right. Now, I'm going to bring in a second Joe, but at first I want to give him a pretty good introduction because not only is a very good friend, but he's also one of the world's top cyber expert. And he's someone that's not only very kind and a very great human being, but he's also a top expert that gets things done and doesn't just talk about things all day, but actually does it. And that's pretty rare, as you all know. So we're pretty lucky to have him. Joe is the founder and CEO of RunSafe Security. They are a pioneer in immunizing software by using a pretty cool capability that effectively will be able to protect the software for embedded systems and containers and cloud workloads. And you'll see how that happens without any friction when it comes to the developer experience and the ability to do it across really vast, diverse set of software technologies. In his career, he has built and scaled technology into companies servicing both the private sector and the public sector. He advised and supported multiple companies, but some of them that you may know is Caprica Security, Sovereign Intelligence, Analyze Corp, of course, Thomson Reuters, Special Services, TRSS, and Distill Network. At TRSS, Joe helped the law enforcement agencies to identify national security threats. And he was a member of the management team and the VP of business development at Targus Info, which was acquired by Neustar for 650 million in 2011. He's a speaker panelist, of course. If you want to have him on an event, do that. Is always fun. We did a lot of panels and events together, and he knows a lot of things about pretty much anything there is to know about software supply chain, 5G, AI, ML, IoT, and even weapon programs. And because he wouldn't be who he is if he wasn't a great human being. He's also the founder of the Children's Voice International, a 501c3 nonprofit. So consider going to check out and help those guys. They provide scholarships for survivors of child trafficking. So great cause, obviously, and something you want to support if you can. So now, without further ado, I'm going to bring Joe on the screen. Good afternoon. How are you doing, Joe?
Hey, I'm doing well, Nicolas. Thanks for the kind introduction. I think the only thing you failed to mention is, my competitive nature in chess against you. So I'm glad you left that out in some ways.
All I remember is, kicking your butt at chess. After that, I just erased it from my memory. And apparently you've been practicing when I've been flying. So now that I haven't played for 2 years, maybe 3 years, I don't know how long that's been. Maybe you can beat me. That's the best you can do probably at that point.
Try to, maximize my ability to win while you have been distracted with other things.
Well, we're certainly going to have to put it to the test and maybe even doing live like we talked about it and see what happens, right? It could be fun. All right. So, we share a little bit of your story, but I always let the guests give us a little bit of their rundown on their journey. So we're going to start there before we do a deep dive into tech stuff, 5G, China, Ukraine. I mean, we handpicked pretty much every buzzword on the planet, but the fact is, in this case, you actually know a lot about these topics. So it's going to be a very meaningful, interesting discussion. So over to you first for your background.
Well, I appreciate what you've already shared. And, I was a management consultant in the 90s, but started my first company in late 1999. And really got the entrepreneurial bug to apply technology and to change economics doing it. And so, through a couple different startups and successful exits, found my way to meet a co-founder of RunSafe Security, Doug Britton. He was introduced to me through a mutual colleague named Stephanie Evans from WilmerHale law firm, who thought, maybe it'll be like peanut butter and jelly. You put Joe and Doug together and hopefully good things will happen. And Doug and I had this kind of common bond and vision around creating security and enabling developers to add security without slowing them down, and to fundamentally change the economics from a security perspective for the defender. For all too long, we've thought about how much people spend to create defenses in their networks or in their software. And really thought if we could find a way to eliminate an entire class of vulnerabilities from being exploited and do that in a way that doesn't slow down developers, then we'd be onto something. And so the past few years, that's been our mission and our driving force. And we were fortunate enough, obviously, along the way to work with you a bit, Nicolas, around DevSecOps. And that kind of embodies ultimately the spirit of where we were going as a company at RunSafe. So with RunSafe, we're protecting all sorts of embedded software from cyber attacks. We're working with Schneider Electric, we're working with Vertiv, we're working with the U.S. government, the Department of Defense on a number of weapons programs, and a bunch of stuff in between all of that. And the common thread is, how can we change the economics of the cyber attack to shift in the favor of the defender? And with that, RunSafe was launched, and RunSafe's been operating globally over the past 5 years and growing fast, especially the past couple of years.
Yeah, no doubt. It's been a pretty big success, and your approach was pretty unique, but people may not know, really first what are memory-based exploits. A lot of people heard of 0 days exploits, maybe, right? What are exactly memory-based exploits? How do you describe it to people that don't understand it?
Yeah, I like to say that memory-based exploits are an attacker's best friend. And the problem is, all the attention we see in headlines usually are around breaches, at the point of compromise, like a phishing attack. We always hear about, how many new systems have been compromised. by virtue of a phishing attack, and someone gains access. The question is, what happens after somebody gains access? And attackers look for weaknesses or software bugs, or in this case, memory bugs in software to deliver, or to, employ their exploit to do something different with that software, something that wasn't intended originally. So, remote code execution or use after free, kinds of things to, maybe it's to extract data, to determine location, or to steer a Jeep, or, crash a drone. All these things, once you gain access, what can you do with it? And so a lot of those exploits, as you say, and a lot of the 0 days that are out there are based on memory-based vulnerabilities in software that's used today. So, for example, we all know that that developers unintentionally introduce bugs within their code. And so some of those bugs that get introduced are memory-based bugs. And what that means is there may be a problem with, enabling a developer or an attacker to create an information leak and really learn all the blueprints of how that software works, so they can determine where to insert their malicious code. And so memory-based vulnerabilities are really one of the worst things out there. To give you an example, MITRE, in 2019 rated memory-based exploits as not only the most common, but the most devastating, since they can wreak so much havoc. A recent study found that 60 to 70% of the vulnerabilities in iOS or Mac OS are memory related. I know your past guest, David Wheeler, talked about Microsoft, and 70% of its vulnerabilities in their products over the last decade have been memory safety issues in general. And even Google has said, publicly, that 90% of Android vulnerabilities are memory vulnerabilities that attackers can use to exploit. And so those kinds of weaknesses lead to information leaks, lead to buffer overflows, lead to heap attacks, return-oriented programming attacks, JOP attacks, and all those things that can overwrite existing code with arbitrary code and insert something that software wasn't intended to do in the first place. So, with that, you can see why memory-based exploits are such a big problem.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the most common, well-known name is, buffer overflow. A lot of people may have heard of that before, where effectively developers make the mistake to let a malicious actor effectively be able to write data into an object that effectively has more bigger size than it can contain, and now you're overlapping that, and that creates effectively a buffer overflow that can be exploited by effectively not having enough space to put the content in there. And that's very common, particularly in lower level programming languages like C, right? And that's where you see, of course, on Linux and Windows, like you said, a lot of the top 0 days. Once you usually get to that stage of a buffer overflow, often you can then use that to get to memory space that's usually not accessible, and that can elevate privileges to root access, and then you can start exploiting that as root, and then you pretty much have full control of the machine. So that's kind of a subset of the memory-based exploit, I guess. So this, like you said, MITRE, was very clear. The largest set of problems we see come from memory-based exploit. So now that we understand that, I guess we talked about some languages, right, like C, that are very low level and effectively rely on the developer to do a good management, right, of allocation of memory and the space to avoid those memory-based exploits. What happens with what we call memory-safe languages like Rust or Go?
Yeah, and obviously modern languages like Rust or Go, offer the advantage. So, the whole idea with Rust and Go and memory safe languages is that they eliminate the potential for those, out of bounds errors or those use after free techniques that could otherwise be exploited. So getting an information leak from something like Go or Rust is much harder, because it's really containing the use of certain parameters that allow for that, buffer overflow or what have you. And so yes, Rust and Go are becoming more and more popular. Unfortunately, they're not going to replace all the code that's out there already in the wild. If you think about how long devices last inside critical infrastructure and in across critical infrastructure and all verticals, they're not going to replace C and C++ overnight, but they're an excellent choice if you're starting fresh with new software. Now, with that said, also, there's an attack that occurred recently in AWS called the Firecracker attack. And if anyone wants to learn about it, they can kind of search on Firecracker AWS attack, where it is still possible, but much harder for attackers to compromise Go or Rust. And so, the whole idea then is if there are ways to lever, some of the parameters to still implement a memory-based attack, then attackers can still, do remote code execution and do those exploits that we talked about. But with Rust, with Go, with others, the likelihood that will happen goes way down, because the ability to, create that weakness in the code is suddenly, much less likely, because the language itself doesn't allow for those out of bounds parameters to be set up in the first place.
Yeah, so effectively, it's a higher level language that has the baked-in safety built in to prevent it, but you're trading off obviously some level of performance, and that's the whole debate. Obviously, a lot of people start to see Rust specifically as a good alternative, even for embedded systems, to start leveraging that as an alternative to C, for example, and so. People looking at those options should obviously compare performances, but most use cases in the world, I would argue the difference is pretty negligible, and you wouldn't see the difference. But you also protect yourself against some of the basic mistakes that already developers are making in memory allocations and things like that. So that's baked in the language. PHP back in the day was also effectively preventing that. Back, when I started, I was 14, 15. And PHP, when we designed it, we made sure that effectively, and by the way, PHP is just abstracting C. PHP is written in C, but that abstraction layer manages the memory aspect. And so variables in PHP are not assigned any kind of allocation. It's dynamically assigned, so it can grow. And you're not stuck with a size, and so you're never going to end up in a memory leak situation, unless of course they find a 0-day in the language itself, which can happen. But that's obviously a patch on the language side, not on the application side. So anyway.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, the software infrastructure that those applications ride on, in fact, are on software binaries that are likely written in these, C, C++ languages, and therefore the underlying software infrastructure can be exploited nonetheless. But 100% right, on the advantages as you described.
Right. All right. So now we mentioned the Project Zero of Google, right? Where they publish 0 days found in the wild, right? Every kind of 0 day, not just Google related CVs. Or 0 days. So what do you think are some of the key insights and implications for having a program like this? Is that helpful? Is that also enabling malicious actors to target things faster and go after different things sooner the better? Or what's the situation that you see happening with Project Zero?
So I personally think what Google has done is a great service for everyone. And if people haven't checked it out, they should check out, Project Zero. And in particular, I like the 0 days in the wild, which is a spreadsheet. It will show you the 0 days that were found, with active attacks happening out in the wild. And what's interesting about it is, even Google itself will say, hey, our data is not necessarily statistically relevant, but you can get a good feel for the characteristics, the behaviors that attackers are using. It turns out, and just for purpose of our discussion today, I double checked it. 68% of the 0 days listed in their 0 day in the wild spreadsheet are memory-based vulnerabilities being exploited actively in the wild. So what's interesting then is you can learn what attackers are doing, learn some of the common mistakes, learn what the current trends are. Again, it's not statistically relevant, but it's directionally correct in terms of what are some of the most recent behaviors. So if you look at 2022, you'll see all sorts of memory-based vulnerabilities out there, and it will characterize exactly what type of problem there is. So memory corruption, logic designs, and flaws. And then who is the vendor and what is the product that's being actively targeted with that. So I personally find this to be a very useful resource to get current news on 0 days found in the wild. A lot of them end up having CVEs that ultimately have patches that can be sorted through. But who knows how long these 0 days have been out there. And that leads to one of the great problems in software and software supply chain is just the exposure window. When 0 days are found, and even well before they were found, how long does it take, for people to respond? But the other interesting thing is just looking at the root cause analysis, and Google or the folks behind, Project Zero, today are doing some of that analysis for you to check it out. So it's a wonderful resource. I check it out all the time. Our team looks at it all the time just to see if new, problems are emerging or new trends are happening, or what the latest behaviors of attackers are, that might be compromising various, software that's commonly used by everybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And here's a link is on the chat. I know Gerald put some links on the GitHub and the blog post wiki stuff. And this is the link here of the 0 day in the wild spreadsheet that you were talking about. And it's definitely something to keep track of and paying attention to what's happening. I was trying to look at they're keeping all the years, right? So they're keeping 2018, the 2016, I see 2014. So I think that this started all the way back to 2014. And if you look at 2022, I guess I only see 23 so far, which is not bad, I guess. That's interesting. Yeah,
there's certainly a lot more. Like 2020 was the greatest count of 0 days found in any 1 year. And it was an astronomical number in 20. I think reporting has gotten better. I think CISA has helped.
Right.
And just awareness in general, I think with software supply chain attacks and all the visibility and all the security vendors that are working on it, for whatever reason, there was a dramatic surge in 0 days reported last year. It was close to 1,000. And if you could look back, over CVEs over, past 20 plus years, the surge was so high this past year. I have to think that, yes, their attacks are probably, way up, but also the reporting's gone way up as well.
Yeah, it's on both sides, probably. A little bit of a mix, right?
Agreed.
Right. All right. So now that we talked about the 0 days, tell us a little bit about what you see on the software supply chain side. And do you feel like we underrepresent the risk?
I do. I think we're only getting started. And, with DevSecOps, with integrated development teams, certainly there is an opportunity going forward for people to share data about their software practices, about their software composition, about their software bill of materials. And so, we have seen a number of attacks, but we also know that folks like Gartner are predicting, that 45% of organizations by 2025 will have a software supply chain attack administered on their enterprise. And I think that's underreporting. I think Gartner is certainly being conservative in this case so as not to be alarmist. And that's not always the case. We usually get a lot of data that might scare people. But in this case, I think it's underrepresented. Why? Because, and you know this, Nicolas, open source software is here to stay. Everyone should be using it, is using it. And there's a lot of great benefits in using it from a security perspective. Why? Because so many eyes are on the code. So many different organizations use that code and rely on it. And of all these practices that are out there. With that said, there is still exposure. there is exposure to the maturity level of the software development practices within the supply chain. We have one client who uses the term their Kevin problem. And Kevin happens to be an open source developer that's maintaining a piece of code that's actually part of critical infrastructure today. And I don't think Kevin, and I'm hiding his name, I don't think Kevin realizes the extent to which his open source software is being used on critical infrastructure applications. What happens if Kevin suddenly stops updating releases or updating the software to fix new vulnerabilities and bugs? We have to account for that from other perspectives. So I guess I say all that because I think the visibility on the software practices within the open source community should be even higher than they are today. But also, fortunately, I think there's a lot of good actors in the open source community and a lot of good, sets of code bases that are being used. Another data point I have, one of my customers deploys software across critical infrastructure. Today, only 20% of their code is open source software. They say by 2025, 2026, 60, 70% of that software they use will be open source software. And what that means is they need to have practices, they need to build those practices today to understand how they're going to make that transition. But as they make that transition, the number of developers who touch your product, goes from a small team, 3 or 4, to 10 to 20 to 100 to thousands of developers are contributing code that go into your products. So we have to get our arms around, what are their software practices? What are the vulnerabilities that they introduce in their code? What is their ability to respond to, vulnerabilities, to bugs and deliver fixes? And what does that whole process look like? So software composition is important. Software bill of materials is important. But just understanding the software methodologies is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess the how do we define software supply chain anyways, right? I hear you talk a lot about open tools, but obviously the supply chain of software doesn't starts and stops with open source software. You would have also a lot of dependencies on SaaS services. You've seen recently a lot of breaches of pretty big service providers, from Okta to Microsoft to others. I guess that impacts that would be considered also, right, an attack on the software supply chain. And so many companies are depending on third-party SaaS services or PaaS or IaaS. That would fall into that category of attack, right? Software supply chain attacks on the SaaS side of the house.
Yeah, and really it's any software vendor that delivers software to you. So you're right, it's way beyond open source software. It includes SaaS software that you use in your enterprise. One of the big issues with SaaS-enabled software that's helping to operate enterprises is just the amount of data, sensitive data that you might have in SaaS companies. And naturally, if that data gets compromised, then you could lose very significant monetary valued information, not only about your customers but about your business practices and things like that. And so I think having visibility on are the controls in place to ensure that your instance of that SaaS software isn't exposing other systems. Certainly on the APIs related. API security is a big deal. So, the reality is, to your point, there is a series of interdependent software applications that really make enterprise function and commerce happen. And so, with the integration of all those different systems, with the integration of, software you're getting from a third party, if you have third parties who are contractors to your organization, they're obviously a part of your software supply chain, as are the developers that you have in-house, as are open source software. So all those are absolutely components. And it's complex. Can you imagine what it's like for a CISO today? And I know you can, Nicolas, but think about it from that perspective. It's hundreds, if not thousands of applications, and it's tens of thousands of developers touching code. We need to get beyond checking the box kind of security. And so we need ways to provide insight, automate, and reduce risk just overall, reduce that attack surface in general.
And I guess, that's why I'm, it's interesting, right? Because when Gartner says 60% or whatever the number was, by definition, it's wrong, because I can tell you, when you start looking at each company providing services and the adoption of SaaS services, those services also use dependencies themselves. And so that compounds the volume of potential threats. If you look at most of these services, and I've been helping a lot of companies, right, trying to do business in DoD. So about 750 companies over the last 3 years have worked with me to take their SaaS service and bring them into an air-gapped DoD-centric, universe. And I can tell you, most of those were not designed for air-gapped, and were dependent on so many services, right? Third-party SaaS APIs, things. So they had to move off of that and bring them as container instead. So I see a movement also of like people bringing back stuff as containers and, removing a lot of dependencies, because they're starting to get worried about, hey, we don't know much about this company we're using here. They're providing us a key service, but if we're going to start selling to financial sector, healthcare, government, they're going to want to have this well controlled and on their instance of their clouds, gov clouds, right? So there are a few key services. I always told people to never use a multi-tenant. It's not just, hey, it's on the cloud. It's not cloud versus on-premise. At the end of the day, that's all data centers, whether we call it a cloud or not, right? But the fact is, what scares me more, I guess, is multi-tenancy versus single tenant, right? I think there are a few services I would never put on a multi-tenant stack. There's three of them that I'm thinking about now. The first one is identity management, because your identities are so important. So using a SaaS service, multi-tenancy service like Okta, I would never do that. I would move it to a single tenant on my cloud, right? So you could still use a COTS, right, or paying or whatever poison you pick, right? But it's I'm not saying build it in house. I'm just saying have a single tenant, right? So that identity is number one. Number two would be policy enforcement point for zero trust. When I see DoD even thinking about using Zscaler, which could not at the time, move their control plane to the Gov Cloud, that seems to be a complete, total nonsense and massive risk. If that gets compromised, effectively, all access control to DoD will get compromised. So using a multi-tenancy hosting that we have no visibility on, right? You've seen Okta when they got breached, they waited 4 months to tell people, right? That all that stuff is very dangerous. And then the third one would be, kind of the all the cyber response and kind of the so we have the identity piece, we have the policy enforcement piece, and then there's always some services that you wonder, okay, should I run that on the cloud as a multi-tenant stack or not? But really, at the very least, right, policy enforcement point, identity management, right, those two, I feel like putting that on the SaaS service would be pretty scary. What do you think about the multi-tenancy aspect versus single tenant?
Well, I think you're exactly right, and in the issue, of course, though, is if you extend this out, beyond your enterprise and think about 5G networks and the like, there are all sorts of issues that kind of creep into play. But if you're thinking about SaaS applications and whatnot, I agree. On the multi-tenancy versus with identity, and naturally, I think that people need to review the whole flow of data and the whole flow of applications that is interacting with their systems. And if you don't have your arms around that, you need to, because that's where you'll kind of figure out what the path to compromising and getting your crown jewels really is.
And the last one I'm thinking also is a Git Repo, right? So many people use GitHub or GitLab, but if your crown jewel becomes Git, because you're moving to GitOps and embracing infrastructure as code, configuration as code, policy as code, effectively someone getting into your Git Repo will compromise your entire stack all the way to access control, right? And so I think multi-tenancy of a Git Repo is also a pretty scary thing. The more you adopt DevSecOps, CI/CD, GitOps, the more of a problem is going to become. So that's the top three for me. All right. So clearly, I agree. I think the risk is vastly underrepresented. I think we also don't find out about some breaches that happen, in my opinion. I think some companies, because of the lack of action from Congress in terms of laws mandating some type of reporting, and also the fact that there is really no consequence, right, for the C-level execs, and people get away with stuff. I mean, you've seen maybe the Uber CISO guy getting in trouble, but that's probably the exception to the rule here. And they did a lot of egregious things to get there, so it's not like the common use case. When you see companies like Okta, right, it's only 2.5% of the customers. Well, okay, but 2.5% of customers could be a lot. And if in the 2.5% you have the U.S. government, that's a problem too, right? So it depends who is in. If you're in the 2.5%, you're going to find the 2.5% to be a problem, right? So it's always based on your self-centered universe. But the fact that they waited 4 months to really disclose it, and what you've been seeing with all the attacks again, the SolarWinds, where they stay dormant in a third-party service, and because you have really no visibility. Let's face it, the SaaS service, FedRAMP or not FedRAMP, I can tell you there is zero visibility from the government standpoint, and the federal agencies have zero visibility in what's going on inside of these enclaves in runtime. So there is no access to continuous monitoring. The fact that a lot of the SaaS services are creating gov versions of Zoom and whatever service, pick your poison, right? They all create their FedRAMP version of that. But I can tell you the visibility the government agencies get on that multi-tenant stack is non-existent. And really, I don't know how you defend something in 2022 without full transparency on the log and telemetry and SIEM and SOAR access to that service. So any service that effectively creates a wall between your continuous monitoring capabilities and the service is probably not something you should use for anything critical, right? Would you agree with that?
I do, and I think monitoring is a key aspect. And just finding out certainly what application performance is doing, but I think there's an opportunity for people to look at software crashes in general. And looking at software crashes can be indicative of either some kind of compromise that's happened, or it could also be indicative of vulnerabilities or bugs that scanning tools hadn't found in the first place. So by all means, the monitoring of your software infrastructure, of your deployments, absolutely essential ultimately. And I think that really closes the loop so people can get a good feel and reduce risk.
Yeah, no doubt. So you talked about it a tiny bit, but a lot of people have different opinions about open source, right? I think a lot of people agree that more eyes on code is great, gives the ability to not only get people to contribute and make it better, but also find issues more rapidly. Putting your head in the sand. I remember when we put some satellite capability that was never seen before ever by the public in DEF CON, I think it was like 5 minutes. It's a very short amount of time. They were completely rooted, and no one had seen it before. And so the concept of putting your head in the sand and hoping for the best is obviously not working. And that's kind of what the DoD and the government was really focused on doing, right? Is like keeping it opaque and OPSEC and making sure no one gets to see it. And, and hopefully people are not going to find a way to get in, right? Although that doesn't work when you start connecting stuff and you start thinking, JADC2, joint all domain command and control, connecting the IoT of military stuff together, right? So where is the line, right? Because when I open source platform one big bang and stuff, a lot of people complain, right? Because I'm always talking about, beating China, but then I'm giving them access to effectively the DevSecOps foundation of the department. But my take was, well, we need adoption from the DIB and the contractors and other companies. And that's more important, right? To get everybody aligned and everybody working together and getting access to the best of breed than giving access to China, because China will find a way to do it anyways, and they will probably hack one of the companies anyways. But at least it spreads faster by making it widely open. What's your take on this?
Well, to me, yes, there is a trade-off, but there's a clear-cut decision, and that is to adopt open source software. And when I talk to people, I say, why don't you write your own calculator for your e-commerce application. Why don't you just write your own calculator if you don't believe open source is useful? And you can hire an extra 10,000 developers to build your systems, and it just doesn't make sense, right? Productivity goes way up if you adopt open source software. But in addition to that, even if you write your own calculator to do your own calculations on tax or whatever it is, right? Even if you do that, your developers are going to introduce vulnerabilities, and there will be fewer eyes on those vulnerabilities, and likely scanning tools aren't going to be able to necessarily identify all the vulnerabilities you introduce. So you get, I hate to say the term, but you get the network effect of so many people who have deployed that same software. And yes, that increases the attack surface in one dimension, but it reduces the attack surface in, where it really matters, where the vulnerabilities are. And so again, that's why I go back to, visibility of your supply chain, identifying the components that are in your software bill of materials. Those are all really good practices to understand what your total overall exposure is. But it doesn't make sense to simply write all the code yourself. And there's still some organizations that insist on that. And I can still guarantee you they have vulnerabilities they don't even know about, they may never know about, and their software is exposed. So I think the trade-off between productivity and security is a simple one in this case. Productivity goes way up, and I actually misspoke, because security benefit goes way up as well. So there's no doubt in my mind, people should be adopting open source software. They should be developing their practices around software supply chain, software composition, software bill of materials, DevSecOps, develop those software practices and incorporate, open source software into your code. Yeah, I'm sure you agree with me ultimately.
Oh yeah, I should have brought you in some of my meetings at the Pentagon, where I had people argue that the DoD should not use any third-party code, and we should build everything from scratch, even if we're a little bit slower, which is not just a little bit. I think they don't understand it's not just a little bit slower. It would be like the difference. I always say, I always say that I'm worried about the DoD getting breached, no doubt, but I'm also worried about the fact that the DoD would potentially become so irrelevant that no one is trying to hack us anymore, right? I don't know which one is worse, right? So the balance, right, about velocity, right, and what some people, not you, but some people think is, hey, I'm going to do less, I'm going to take less risk by not using open source software, despite the fact that they're missing the point that, hey, we have access to the source code, we can see what's going on, there's more eyes on it, right? Versus like some black box that you have no clue what's going on. It's compiled code. You cannot really scan it very well. It's really, very tough to assess, right? So you could have a bunch of vulnerabilities, right? The fact is there's a lot of CVEs. Look at Atlassian, right? The code is not open source. That didn't stop them from being the worst disgrace in the history of software, right? So clearly, you have all these use cases, and people argue, right? Like Kubernetes, right? I had a team come to me and say, hey, we had this great idea. We're gonna recreate Kubernetes from scratch. And I was like, what are you saying? How did you come up with a genius idea of spending $1 billion of taxpayer money to end up recreating something that already exists, and probably do it worse and not in a timely fashion?
Yeah, and General Greg Toohill is the director of the CERT division at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon. Obviously,
I need to bring him on the show, Greg. I forgot. I'm going to do that.
He would be a great guest because he can talk about studies that they've done on the benefits of open source software, and I am all in with him. So he has studies going back 20 years on security. He has studies on productivity gains. And so, I think he's a leading authority on the matter, given his, now recent role as the director at the CERT division.
Yeah, I worked with him first at DHS, and then he became the first Fed CISO, and then worked a lot on Zero Trust with software-defined perimeter, and then he joined Appgate, where he was, kind of the leading company on software-defined perimeters. So, and now another CERT. So, and
I know we're going to get into 5G a little more, but just the idea, since you mentioned Zero Trust and we're talking about open source software, just the idea of trusted software that you write yourself that, and the fallacy in that. The same is true in, building a trusted network. If you can imagine a trusted network, as soon as you say it's a trusted network that no one, you
already lost,
right? You've lost. So it's similar to that.
Yeah. And it doesn't scale too, right? That might be true if you're one person, right? But you stop bringing people, devices, and nonsense, and scale, and cloud, and right, and everything falls apart, right? So that's the other thing is scale and resiliency and dependencies, and so when I looked at obviously Platform One and the work we've done, and I see now 7 nations use Platform One. Big bang open source, right? I've seen dozens of dev companies adopting it. I've seen banks. I've seen healthcare companies. I've seen even CNCF companies use the stuff, right? So clearly the adoption is really one of the most successful, engagement with industry outside of some of the IC stuff. I think for DoD it's really of the first. I think for the IC is pretty good. The NSA particularly is very good at open sourcing stuff. And sometimes we don't even know where it came from, but it came from NSA, So they're pretty good at that. They're also pretty good at getting some of their exploit getting leaked, but that's a different story. But if you look back, right, at some of the kind of push we've done, with Platform One and kind of the traction you've seen, have you seen people talk about the stuff we've done in DevSecOps on the industry side?
Well, for sure. I mean, at RunSafe, as you know, our tools got certified as part of the program. We participate in Iron Bank. And when we talk to other organizations, folks like Lockheed Martin were obviously significant advocates of Platform One. And so it's spreading in a significant way in my book. And, and the point that you can simply, develop a practice that's already, kind of take the guessing work out of it. Here's a best practice for, how to build to dramatically improve your software development process, is a big deal. And you think about an organization like MassMutual. I look at what you did and what the Air Force did, implementing DevOps and DevSecOps in a massive way, right? MassMutual has something like 80 to 100 development teams, several different projects going on at the same time. And they all had, if you go back a couple of years, they all had very different software development practices. You had no idea if your developers were in fact testing. You had no idea if they were employing any automated techniques. All you could really do is ask if they had done something. So what I like about the maturing uses in automated pipelines and whatnot is also then the ability to sort of track what has been done. And so, there's new solutions out there that are kind of tracking as well. And I think that's a great step forward because, it's sort of the notion of trust but verify. You've got all these best practices, implement them, follow the procedures. And if you do, good things happen. If you start, I use a silly example. If I go to Starbucks and I notice that the barista and the person taking the order don't follow the steps, their error rate goes way up. They mess up your drink. They add too many shots of caffeine or whatever. They forget to add the vanilla. I know you like all the frou-frou components into your coffee, Nicolas, but if they go out of order, the same thing with pilots. My father-in-law, and I know that's a big topic for you. My father-in-law was a check pilot at U.S. Airways and United and different airlines, and they would intentionally mess up the order in which they relayed information to pilots. And when they did, the error rate went way up because they were expecting orders, and they could prepare their mind for information that comes in a similar way. I think having defined steps that you automate in the CI/CD process is very similar to that. And so if we can monitor and enforce that people are actually implementing all these steps, then everybody wins. And with Platform One, having a approved checklist of tools you can use was a huge step forward for organizations. And I just go back to MassMutual and say they had 80 development teams, which meant At that time, they had 80 different software development processes. And I'm not saying you have to impose, the process, but you need to impose the discipline and check all the boxes in a positive sense. And so, organizations like Lockheed Martin were huge fans of Platform One. And we talked about what we had done with you all. That was instant credibility for us, given their excitement about it.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, you kind of hinted at it, but we're going to get into 5G now. So I guess when you look at what's going on in 5G, what's really at stake, and what do you think are the current issues, both on the cyber side, the physical side, the supply chain side? Where are we on the fight? Everybody, in fact, I just this week, funny enough, here in the middle of nowhere where I live, they finally got us a 5G antenna. So I have 5G on my phone. So I finally have it here. So it probably means it's happening everywhere else because I live in the middle of nowhere. So tell us more about this.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things is people like you are always the late adopters on technology and have to catch up with everybody else. It's good that you're joining the 5G party. The way I look at 5G, there's a lot more at stake than just security, that just technology for technology's sake. I think there's an entire economic, kind of competition going. If I look back to 4G and 4G adoption, Verizon, AT&T, other telcos kind of paved the way. They invested in infrastructure, and what was the result of that? That meant that application providers, data companies, and other folks enabling commerce, would be able to, do what they did, on the latest technology, on the next generation, kind of networks, if you will. And so those companies invested heavily in doing that. And because more and more applications got built on those networks, on that infrastructure, Verizon, AT&T, and others had an advantage. Their technology was adopted. If I fast forward to 5G, I think about it in the same way. It's kind of a competition. And whoever really controls 5G infrastructure, 5G, networks, is going to pave the way for all that commerce that's going to follow. It's something like, I've seen some forecasts, and I can share this link. I'm sorry I don't have it, but something like $3.6 trillion are at stake in terms of future economic activity over 5G equipment, over 5G networks. And something like 25 million jobs or more are at stake over who wins kind of the 5G race and who controls and operates those networks and what technology is in that. And so, I look at China and I look at the adoption. We struggled in the United States. We struggled around, how do we roll out that mid-band adoption of 5G, spectrum, if you will. And you have, kind of the high band and low band, and they have pros and cons, but the mid-band there is the sweet spot for 5G activity that we all expect, going forward. And, China clearly had a huge lead on that. And you can imagine if you're the provider of, infrastructure in a country that has the huge lead, that means you have a huge advantage economically to roll your technology out globally in other, areas to build that infrastructure. And so you can imagine what's at stake here. And the U.S., is and has been behind. So from a technology and security perspective, if we move past the economic, stake, if you will, there are both implications. Certainly there is security implications. And we talked about zero trust a little bit. I've heard in the past a lot of people, talk about, like I said before, trusted networks. And if we just had a trusted 5G network, everyone would be safe. And it's actually the opposite. As soon as you say you have a trusted network, it's never going to actually be trusted. It will be compromised. Imagine, the contractor that goes out to service equipment, they can potentially implement something that compromises that otherwise trusted network. And so I think this is where open source software supply chain, and your supply chain of equipment for that infrastructure all intersect. And given what's at stake on the economic front, developing those best practices to protect that software, to implement zero trust in those networks is really, what's needed going forward. So, all those software protections in 5G devices, are absolutely needed. And I go back just to kind of finish the point. As I go back, there was a study by GCHQ a couple years ago, and you looked at software that Huawei had shipped. You look at the source code, and you look at the end product that was produced through the compiler. And at first, GCHQ couldn't find any differences. They then asked for details about the compilation process and found that in the compiler, in just post-compilation steps, there were areas where backdoors could be inserted. And so we need ways to counter those kinds of sneaky attacks into software that gets into these 5G networks. Otherwise, we run the risk of not just losing on the infrastructure side and the application side, but also on the security side. So I think there's a lot at risk in 5G. And I'm curious, Nicolas, if you agree, because those are kind of my thoughts at a macro level where I think there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, but I also think, effectively, if you miss the 5G race, you're going to miss the next one because it's going to be very tough to catch up. I mean, you can leapfrog, but that's pretty rare at that point because they have the benefit of all the adoption, the revenue, the technology experience, the massive scale. So, and the fact that, it took so much effort, for people to say, hey, we're not going to use Huawei technology, and many nations has to stand up after many times deals were signed to go back and say, hey, maybe we should not let that happen. Maybe too little, too late. Robert Spalding, former general, is a very good. I'm going to invite him to the show because he has a great set of insights when it comes to China and the way they do business and the way they sneaky, play their games to get into the, like you said, having that ability to demonstrate first that, hey, here's a code, here's a battery, no issue. And then there's backdoors built in that are very tough to find. And they're hoping you're not going to find it, of course. But that's a pretty scary, thought. And it's just like TikTok, right? Letting China have foothold over our kids' education and kind of information gathering aspect is just mind-boggling to me. But so.
Yeah, I have a teenage daughter, and she uses TikTok all the time. And it's if you can correlate, children and maybe OPM data breach data with TikTok application usage and location, it's a scary thought if you let your conspiracy theories go. But to me, it's not so much about that conspiracy ultimately thinking that all that could happen. It just should motivate you to take extra caution in how we think about the business applications we deploy and the security we employ.
Yeah, I think we're kind of past the conspiracy now because honestly, after I don't know if you've seen the last testimony of that lady from TikTok that went to Congress again and talked about what they share or don't share with China and the CCP. It felt pretty obvious to me that they don't want to answer the questions and that they have Chinese employees on payroll, both with Biden's, but even at TikTok proper. And while they claim they have, mitigation to control access, there's a lot of senior executives that are Chinese and she refused to answer whether or not they were a member of the CCP. Obviously they're going to be members of CCP. It's just what it is. They don't really get a choice in China to say no anyways. That's what people need to remember. So, and moving the data, the Trump administration tried to, ban it. And then they committed to moving the data to Oracle, right? But that's useless, right? It's not bad, but it's useless. Because if Chinese still have access to the data, it's just like, okay, you just made a hop, now I have to take it from Oracle back to China instead of just straight in, but that doesn't change much. And when you look at the data they capture, I don't know if you looked at the terms and conditions, but they get all your apps running. It's not just geolocation and stuff. It's every file you have on the phone, file names. So every file you download, on your phone, all the apps you use, it's pretty much everything that is on the phone.
And what I worry about, I guess, just to kind of restate what I was saying earlier. So if my daughter, if your child is 16 years old today, you go back to the OPM breach 10, 12 years ago or whatever it was. And, if that same child is on, their data is on the OPM breach, they know who they are and they know how they map to other people that likely were in that database and likely had security clearances. And now all the file information and all the data about those users, and their locations. And so it's a wealth of information that can be correlated together, is my point.
Oh yeah, and you have what they like, what they don't like. They can show up to your book study because you like books about whatever, and they like, oh, I love these books too. Want to be your friend. So it's a very exciting gift we're giving to the CCP for them to be able to have. Yeah, and I've seen a number when I was on Tucker at for Fox talking about TikTok. They were, I think the number was 30% of kids under 24 years old, or 40% of kids under 24 years or 28 years old use TikTok as a main source of search instead of Google, right? So they literally search on TikTok now. That's where they start controlling information, misinformation, pushing whatever content they want to push, right? I saw the leadership of TikTok announce they're gonna do something to prevent misuse of TikTok during the election. They're gonna label content, but it's just assuming that the CCP is gonna show up and identify as CCP to be like, yeah, I'm CCP. I'm gonna give you misinformation. It's like they all very well know, and it's the same on Facebook and every platform, right? They're hiding in plain sight, and many times in the U.S. they have plenty of people here. They don't need to spoof IPs or I'll do that kind of stuff. Anyway, it's just interesting, and it's pretty scary for kids, right? And meanwhile, of course, China is banning U.S. technology, so that's just interesting, right? That what do you think that why isn't Congress taking some sort of action in terms of privacy? You've seen GDPR, right, with Europe. Why would you think the U.S. would not have at least some level of protection about the U.S. data?
I mean, this is the age-old question. We've been debating this for years now, right? And of course, you have GDPR in Europe, and you have some level of privacy things in different states in the United
California
States.
Is a big one. Yep.
Yeah. Of course, we're set up that way. We're set up, where there are a lot of action that might be coming from the states, and I guess the issue is, it's a function of privacy and security as a trade-off, and convenience. And so, to me, there's definitely more that can be done. And in the meantime, the public or the industry needs to lead the way. And I think we need to come up with ways to reduce some of the risk. And in fact, I think there might be some lessons from some other things going on in the world that apply here. But naturally, it's hard. So, it's a complex set of issues. It requires someone as smart as you, Nicolas, to kind of figure out what the right issues are. And you think about Congress trying to figure out what is the right answer. They want to legislate, but they can't really specify the technology or the tactic that's used. And so what I've seen in other industries, like in nuclear, is where you specify disciplines that need to be employed, and not necessarily, specifying certain, the how, right? And that's the trick. That's the balance that's needed. So we need to help Congress, come up with that right language, and we need, government leaders to kind of step in and advocate as well, and striking that right balance so it doesn't hurt business, but also creates a semblance of privacy is needed. And, there are definitely identity things that can help, and there's definitely, security protections that can help. But without that right balance, I don't see how Congress can get it right.
Yeah, and I remember when people started talking about GDPR, everybody agreed it was bloated. I mean, so far it's been doing pretty well. I mean, I don't know how much it prevented in terms of issues, but, I think it's I would still want something more balanced than GDPR, I think. But like you said, it's a balance between, too much government, not enough. I'm obviously a pro for less government after seeing the waste in the government. California goes to the extremes. Of course, they also at the same time then they banned gas-powered cars. They tell people not to charge their EVs because the grid wasn't capable of sustaining the charging stations. So, maybe we shouldn't listen to what they say too much. I don't know, but at least they do have a privacy thing that's very similar to GDPR. But at the same time, they have pretty much every law on the books because they are believing in this bloated government constraints and not the self-regulating citizenship. So anyway, that's just interesting. So we talk about 5G. Now I want to talk about Ukraine a little bit. All fun subjects. So you look at what happened in Ukraine with Russia, and on the cyber side, many people thought Russia would go all in with cyber, right, and really completely destroy every aspect of the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. They've done so back in 2017 with NotPetya, right, and that kind of backfired and cost, I think it's $2 billion to the U.S. taxpayer in terms of losses, and companies in terms of losses of the virus spreading, the malware spreading outside of Ukraine as well. And that's kind of the issue with these kind of malware, right? You know where they start, but you don't know where they end. So what's your take on the cyber lessons that we've seen from Ukraine?
Yeah, and obviously I don't have specific information to share, but I can speak anecdotally and talk about just kind of my observations on what I do know and what has been in the public. And one of those things, just to kind of build on your point there, John Deere actually had some equipment stolen and brought back to Russia. And John Deere, in some ways, was very well prepared for this. They had sort of a remote shutoff switch.
That's pretty scary, though. I don't know if I like it, but yes.
But it helps, right? Like, it helps in this situation.
It helps when you're on the right side of the thing. But if they shut off your tractor, I'm sure you're not too happy.
Exactly.
One day they decide to do it for the wrong reasons. But yeah.
And that there is the two sides of every issue. That I don't know how you legislate that. But that's an example of I do think that industry in some aspects of critical infrastructure, we're in fact prepared. And whether that's, credit to CISA, credit to, major, infrastructure providers or folks like John Deere or Schneider Electric, others who have experienced attacks in the past, they're, in having some advanced intelligence about what could happen. I think some organizations were actually prepared for it. So I point to John Deere as someone that had a method to, you might not like it, but they had a method to kind of mitigate or remediate in that particular situation. Because naturally, I think about the great promise of software. And the beauty in software is that you can produce 1 million copies of the exact same software, and they do the exact same thing. So like on a drone or on a plane, you have 100 drones in a fleet, and they all have identical software. Then you expect with the same inputs, you always get the same outputs because the software always behaves the exact same way. From the attacker's perspective, it's the same thing. So if you find a vulnerability in one of those drones, you can build an exploit to compromise any of those drones. And so, I in that case with John Deere, let's hope they were able to prevent, any future compromises as a result of that. But despite some of the information that we have, I think that the cybersphere is, part of the new model for warfare. Obviously, there's firing missiles and there's, sending troops on the ground. But cyber is, a part of the domain, part of the arsenal that is needed. And if you can take out satellites, you can take out GPS, you can disrupt comms, then you can, really disable your adversary from, and their forces to operate or to, do counterattacks or what have you, because they can't communicate. And so I think communications in general, because it's been sustained, and in Ukraine, it's interesting because taking out some of the satellites, Elon Musk wanted to have a bunch of other satellites there to back up so communications won't be disrupted. But I guess the point in all of that is communications is essential in war and is essential to preserve in war. And so we need everything we can to protect the communications infrastructure in war. So I think that's a key thing. Another key thing, and you touched on it in different ways around misinformation. We can't stop everything that's going to happen. But really, if you're just going to roll over and blow up buildings and try to take over a town, you still have to win the minds and hearts of the people in that town if you're going to stay there a long time. So controlling the message is a key thing in war, and certainly misinformation that can manipulate the response is extremely powerful. And Russia is very good at that. Whether they're using automation, using botnets, they're strong in kind of influencing things in that regard. So social media and, especially Twitter and other things become vulnerable points that influence. Certainly it's good because we're getting information from, war is different in the 21st century. We're getting information from social media that we otherwise wouldn't get. But we're also susceptible to misinformation as a result of all that. And so how to counter that is key and could have implications on other wars down the road. And lastly, I would just say, thinking about TikTok and video and all of that, deep fakes are a concern. And, if at some point in the future, it looks like a leader has said one thing and actually a leader comes on and says, I never said that, that wasn't me. You can imagine in a stressful time like in war, what kind of confusion that can create. So I think all of these are lessons, whether avoided or, potentially, disrupted, are lessons in thinking about what are the new tactics in war in the 21st century. And ultimately, I'd just say, if you take out the nuclear power plant, you take out a utility, you take out water, you can really disrupt the well-functioning normal society from operating. If you take out communications, you can also disrupt the ability for the adversary to respond. And naturally, that's always been out there, but there's new forms of communication and new attacks with cyber, that can be administered, and we have to be on guard for it.
Yeah, and communication is so important, right? The reason why they had so many deaths of general officers is because their communications were so compromised. They had no choice but to use cell phones and things that were able to be tracked. And then apparently Ukraine also posted, fake profiles of girls to try to, attract the men to respond. And then they got the locations and were able to target those guys that thought they were getting lucky, but they were not getting too lucky after all. So that's interesting. And you've also seen, with Viasat and the attack on the even to the point of disabling the hardware and having to swap the ground systems. They without Starlink and without Elon Musk, Ukraine would be in a very tough spot. Starlink was able to ship a bunch of devices and relocate some satellite, by the way, to adjust and the coverage of the Ukrainian nation. That tells you kind of the importance of software-defined weapons / capabilities. And very space Russia started targeting the Starlink systems and found an issue. But within 2 hours, the SpaceX team was able to do a software update and patch it. So that tells you also the DevSecOps capability of doing over-the-air update and rapidly spreading, fixes is actually the difference between winning and losing a war. And so that's a massive capability. And so the other aspect, of course, of why is Russia not using all of the cyber arsenal against Ukraine is also because they don't want to start, impacting other nations that would then have a good excuse to get involved and then spread into World War III. So I think the reason why Russia is now using all of the capabilities they have is definitely because they don't want the U.S. to get more involved. So if they were not Petya number 2, where they end up costing billions of taxpayer money, I think that could give a good excuse for the U.S. to get involved. So they don't want to do that. At the same time, it's interesting, just like the same reason why they don't use nuclear weapons. They wouldn't do that, right? It's the same concept. People always struggle as to why people don't use all of the weapons that people have at their disposal, but it's kind of the same logic, right? Not to mention on the nuclear side, the the fall downs would fall back into Russia. So I'm not sure that would be very useful. So these things like this, and it's the same thing, kind of the ripple effects, the butterfly effect, whatever you want to call it, right? Where you know where you begin, but you don't know where it stops. And I think on the cyber side, they don't want to give countries excuses to get involved, and so they're not using all of the capabilities they have. But at the same time, I think Ukraine also learned quite well from the NotPetya time how to harden their critical infrastructure much better. And I think they did a pretty good job at doing that to make sure that power and water capabilities are not disrupted by basic, capabilities where hackers were not already dormant into the systems like we have here with so many different companies providing grid and water capabilities to the United States. That's definitely an impediment we have, having so many companies to deal with. We can't really, CISA has no ability to go and help so many different companies just with the grid aspect. It's too many things to worry about. It doesn't scale. So, all right. So we talked about Russia and Ukraine. Let's take a look at now, what's going on. And you kind of mentioned, right, the importance of Taiwan and then kind of the chips, but you mentioned communications, right? And every exercise we've done at the Pentagon, tabletop exercise, in the situation room where we simulate attacks, every single time within 24 hours, the United States had no comms anymore against China, right? So we'll be in the same spot than Russia, right? Effectively. What do you think is at stake when it comes to the technology, and then more broadly, maybe as geopolitical aspects when it comes to Taiwan and China? Just yesterday again, I think, or the day before, the president said that U.S. would be involved in helping Taiwan if China was to decide to attack. I don't know how much he means it or not, but at least he said, we would have troops and things like that. So it's not just like Ukraine giving money, although we gave a lot of money to Ukraine, by the way, probably too much money. I don't know. But what do you think about Taiwan?
Well, I guess all situations are different. So it's hard to totally compare Ukraine and Taiwan. But one of the big differences in Taiwan, as you had indicated, is really this semiconductor industry, the electronics industry, the manufacturing, and all of that's so vital to today's economic infrastructure, and all the technology advancement is in part built on what happens in Taiwan. And there's a big scare, obviously, related to grain shipments in Ukraine, and the supply of grain, obviously a massive issue. But the technological implications in Taiwan are serious and real. And naturally, a lot of companies are trying to diversify their own, abilities, or their own, manufacturing plants, and diversifying where they are. And so I think there's a point at which, hopefully, industry is diversified. But when that happens, I think the economic ties to Taiwan shift. I think that is when China. So I think China might wait. I think China might wait until they do play the long game, and obviously it's been 20 some years, since the late 90s. But nonetheless, as countries diversify their manufacturing and their supply chain itself, that makes Taiwan more vulnerable. And so today there's an economic interest that's vital, and that's why I think the threat, of getting involved may be higher than Ukraine. With that said, I also think China knows that there's economic ties that sustain the globe, and if they do attack and that does get disrupted, much like your point around kind of avoiding certain cyber attacks in Ukraine, so other people don't get more actively involved, the economic interests that happen in Taiwan today could be compromised, and that would affect a lot of organizations, which would mean more and more countries would have to take a closer look. So I think the technological aspects make Taiwan a little bit different, and naturally the geopolitical situation and the kind of the competitive nature of China and the United States and just the influence in the region, is a serious thing. So obviously, the United States doesn't want to just kind of give that up, and naturally, China wants to exert more and more influence. But I think the economic ties is one dimension that you can't ignore when it comes to Taiwan.
So Congress just passed, what is it, 54 billion on the chip law to help American companies bring back some manufacturing of chips here. Do you think that's anecdotal compared to the volume of money spent on the chip industry? Do you think it's good enough? Is it a good first step, or is it just anecdotal and a rounding error?
I don't know the exact numbers. I think it's a great step, though. And obviously more will be needed, but if we need something that helps to jumpstart, and as long as that demand continues and that supply delivers on what's expected, then an injection of that kind of money can make a big difference, right? There are folks like Gilman Louie who are doing some really interesting things, with public-private partnerships. They're certainly hoping for government investment, but they're not relying on it. And Gilman has, a new organization that is, looking to jumpstart investments in things that are critical to the national security, critical to a well-functioning society. And so I also think that it will be supplemented by organizations like that. And behind that initiative was both Eric Schmidt and Peter Thiel, and had support from folks on both sides of the aisle, if you will. And so, I do think
there'll be the only one pretty much of the last 2 years, probably. Already had real joint support of both sides. That's good.
Yep, only one. And but I do think that it's what matters is how some of these organizations execute when they start building stuff. They need to build great products with that money that they have, and if they do, more will come from it. So that's what I'm hoping for. And I do think we have to diversify. And I do think we have a major security vulnerability or threat to national security. And that's technology dependency, in countries that may no longer be able to supply that, or may be, somehow hampered in terms of ability for the U.S. to source technology from certain areas. So, I do think funding something like that is a good idea for the United States.
Oh, it's definitely a good idea. Just so you know, the entire semiconductor market in 2022 is 700 billion. That's the revenue of the market. So that doesn't include how much people spend in R&D. Okay, so 55 billion is what, maybe 7%. It's not bad, but it's probably. I mean, the fact is companies should have proactively done it anyway, so the government is just stepping up. They shouldn't have to do that, but I get why we are doing it, and I'm sorry for it, but I still wonder how much of that is going to make a difference, because I just know how good the government is at wasting money. So of the 55 billion, if we get 5 billion spent on chips and actual manufacturing, is probably the best outcome you could get. Without
I hope it's higher than that, Nicolas. I hope it's higher than that.
10% is 10% is actually not bad for the government. 20 is very good, and 30 is like exceptional. So anyway, it's kind of the issue is all the bureaucracy and all the nonsense and all the wrong things and lobbying and all that good stuff. So who knows? But so obviously you talked about China also feeling the impact. At the same time, I feel like they got away so much with COVID, including to the point where they were so powerful. And I think that should scare a lot of people, kind of the power of China to convince people not to talk about the lab, ban the story, even talking about the story when people are dying, and making it look like a conspiracy theory where us in the government were pretty convinced from the get-go that he came out of the lab. And now I don't think most government people would have a doubt that the virus came from a lab. My only question was, did China do it on purpose or by accident? That was my only real question I had, not whether or not he came from a lab or not. But the fact that they managed to, convince Facebook and others to ban it, right, to ban the story so no one could talk about it, that scares me a lot, right? Because I can tell you, if the virus came from, Egypt, I can tell you we will call it the Egyptian virus, and no one would think twice. But yeah, when people started calling it China virus and stuff, people freaked out. I wonder if now they feel like, hey, we got away with it. We sold a bunch of equipment. All the masks came from China. They made billions from it, right? I wonder what would be the parallel to a Taiwan disruption, because they would start selling the chips in the meantime, right? So then we're then forced to buy chips from China. What do you think when you see companies like Apple, right, that use manufacturers in Taiwan? I don't know if you've seen the story, but Apple, buys chips in Taiwan, and China just changed the law for imports, right, to bring the chips in China to then build the phone, right? They mandate that the label from the chip coming from Taiwan says made in China, not made in Taiwan. So Apple forced their vendors in Taiwan to change the labels on their product to say made in China, so they could bring it into China to build the phone. So then we can end up having a shitty phone at a $1,200 back in the US, right? With no innovation whatsoever for the last 5 years. So when American companies start being complicit on that, right, just because they want to ship the device, how are we going to win this?
Well, hopefully there's other controls at play, and organizations like Apple do have some other controls in play to ensure they know what's going on each of those devices. However, that doesn't really solve the problem globally, and so most organizations don't have the same quality control and manufacturing control that someone like Apple does. And so, the risk more generally is very, very high. And so we need ways to know what, I guess what the processes are like. And we need confidence that organizations are going to do that. But I think organizations need to diversify where they make things and really, crack down themselves on their own quality control and their own security controls that are in place. Because otherwise, we do lead and become vulnerable to some kind of surveillance state that knows exactly what's going on at the chip level, at the data level, at the application level, and all levels. And that's what we have to try to avoid in order to maintain, a free society, free to engage, as we wish. So I think there's a lot at stake, and I think the controls in place by organizations, they need to realize that it is actually a national security issue, but it's actually, what is the international order that you really want to participate in? Do you want a top-down, heavy surveillance state, model, or something of free markets and a series of interdependent technologies that apply best practices towards security and protecting the users and consumers?
Yeah, no doubt. All right, last question for you today. So as it stands, and not in the future, not projections, not maybes, but with what we know, what we're doing today, what's happening in the world, will the U.S. win or lose the dual race, AI cyber race with China?
Well,
as it stands?
Nicolas, I know you'll be disappointed since you believe America is winning the race and is so far ahead that, what I say may come to a surprise to you. But all kidding aside, I do think we're behind. I do think we'll lose. I do think a lot of things have to change. Part of what has to change is the investment in technology going forward. And part of what needs to change is an acknowledgement that, we need to preserve, the technology across cyber, across 5G, across quantum, across AI, ML. We need to preserve our leadership in areas that matter going forward. And my fear is that we do fall into some kind of surveillance in our day-to-day lives that none of us really want. And so I think there's kind of a collision course here of, the surveillance state versus a series of interdependent connected networks operating, allowing for the free exchange of ideas and the free exchange of commerce. that's at stake. And, if we don't invest further in these areas, and I think you have some really good ideas on what we should be investing in, but I just look at cyber, look at 5G, look at quantum, look at AI, ML, and things like that. And yes, we have many talents and a lot of great companies, but somehow, we're going to have to accelerate our ability for all of that to come together in a way that can counter what China is building or has been investing in the past.
Yeah, and I think what people often forget is while you have a lot of US companies leading in AI and ML and things like that, they don't do any business with DoD and the Defense Department. And so then you end up having a vast disparity of capabilities between the military side and the commercial side, which is not the case in China. So despite being a little bit behind, China on the commercial side has the advantage on the government side, because of course they force all their companies to do business with the CCP. That's the big difference that I think people don't realize. They also have 120 million science and technology experts, or at least graduate. That's a third of the United States right there. So just volume wise, to be able to compete will be very tough. So we have to be smarter, faster, stronger, with leaner, less bureaucracy, more eagerness, and they're very motivated, very eager to get it done. We're a little bit complacent, winning for too long. When a nation starts winning for too long, and despite the fact that you've seen the Afghanistan debacle and things like that, that should probably wake people up. But even with that, right, people often dismiss it to go back to their daily lives, right? And we go back to the Kumbaya universe, where people are more focused on fighting between parties than realizing that the real enemy is not inside of the United States, despite some of the current politicians telling us, but it's really with China. And that's, dividing us is just helping China win. And that's what scares me a lot.
I agree.
Well, we're going to give you the last words in a second. I'm going to remind everybody of the next episode. Next Tuesday, we're going to have a great friend and also someone that's coming with an amazing background between the Nuclear Center in the Air Force and the software. He was the first chief software engineer in the Air Force, and he's brought DevSecOps to GBSD, the nuclear program. Carl Fox will be joining us next Tuesday, 1 p.m. We're going to have a discussion about not just cybersecurity and the DevSecOps, but really the rise of software-defined weapons and kind of the challenges and what it takes to succeed in bringing DevSecOps to jets and bombers and nuclear systems. We're going to talk about his new program called the Sentinel, and how is the U.S. doing when it comes to the race against China as well. So it's going to be a lot of fun with Carl Fox next Tuesday at 1 p.m. Wanted to thank Joe for joining us. We're so lucky to have you to share with us all these great discussions. We'll give you now the last words for you to share your thoughts, and wanted to thank everybody for joining us, and wanted to thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and I certainly appreciate the chance to be on the show and to talk about these issues. Software development practices that that you brought to the DoD and have championed for so long, I think, are vitally important for for all of our organizations, whether in industry or in the government or in DoD, for the U.S. to remain competitive. And I think if that's how I could leave it is we all have a duty, I think, and you led by example, to innovate, to invest in technology, and really to push the envelope and apply good security practices. And when folks like you and others go out and and push forward, I think we all win. And so I would just encourage everybody else to follow your lead, to invest in technology, to invest in security, to think about your processes, and to innovate. And really, in the end, that matters as much as all the investment other organizations make. But doing things in a common sense way and thinking about the problems and innovating ultimately is good. And I think if we do, we can rise to a lot of the challenges that the country faces, we can rise to, a lot of the challenges that impede progress, or and ultimately I think about in the 5G world, with a series of interdependent economic systems operating in a zero trust environment, preserving the ability for open society to operate in the way we have, I think is one motivating factor that we can all use to carry forward, to follow your lead, to innovate and do the right thing. So I appreciate being on the show today and sharing some thoughts on these topics, and certainly appreciate your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. Everybody, wanted to thank you again. Stay safe, stay healthy, and more importantly, keep up the good fight so our kids have a fighting chance at winning against China 20 years from now. Stay safe. See you soon. See you Tuesday. Bye-bye.